Hi, welcome back to Tomcat Memories. I'm Dave Baranek, former F-14 Radar Intercept Officer, or RIO, and Top Gun instructor, and my call sign was Bio. Today I'm going to tell you a story about the time I did ACM below the hard deck. Now this is a story I've told before. Someone will ask me, what was my most memorable flight in all of my 2,500 flight hours in the F-14? And this ranks right up there. I also wrote the story in the book before Top Gun days, in the collection of fleet vignettes at the end of the book. But today I'm going to reveal something that I haven't told in almost 40 years. The fact that most of that engagement took place right on the deck. To get started, let me give us some background. What is the soft deck and the hard deck? You've probably heard these terms. You may not know exactly what they mean. So what I did was I referenced OpNav instruction 3710.7 uniform, which is NATOP's General Flight and Operating Instructions. I want to make sure I get this right. The soft deck. It says that high angle of attack and slow speed maneuvering shall be terminated passing through 10,000 feet above the ground level. That's defined as the soft deck. And it goes on to say that the 10,000 feet can be above the ground level or above an undercast cloud layer. So if there's an undercast layer at 4,000 feet, then the soft deck would be at 14K. Hard deck. No sustained maneuvering shall occur below a 5,000 foot hard deck above the terrain or undercast. So the soft deck is 10,000 feet above the terrain or the undercast, and the hard deck is 5,000 feet above the terrain or the undercast. And normally an ACM engagement is terminated as a rocks kill if you bust the hard deck. But that wasn't the case in this flight. I pulled out my logbook to verify the fact, and the flight that I'm talking about today took place in December 1982. There it is. I wrote Project Rising Fighter right there. The location was R2301 West near Yuma, Arizona. Here's the image that shows what the airspace is. And this was also the location of the Yuma TACTS range, Tactical Aircrew Combat Training System. And that's the instrumented range that recorded in great detail everything that the aircraft did and also gave real-time indication in the TACTS trailer. This flight was a part of Project Rising Fighter. This is a project that was run by Commander Fighter Airborne Early Warning Wing U.S. Pacific Fleet, or COMFIT AEW Wing Pack, or we just said COMFIT. Rising Fighter was an effort to look into tactics to counter the MiG-23 Flogger, which was a then new threat. Remember, this was 1982. And it was the first Soviet tactical fighter that could shoot us in the face, forward quarter missile capability. Now, the Flogger's radar wasn't as good as the F-14's AUG-9, but its AA-7 Apex missile had fairly similar performance to the AIM-7 that we used in the F-14. You might say, well, what about the Phoenix? In those days, the thinking was that the Phoenix would be reserved for defending the carrier strike group. So if we were in a tactical situation, we planned to carry AIM-7s and AIM-9s, and of course our trusty gun. Different F-14 squadrons at Miramar took turn participating in Rising Fighter. It consisted of a series of flights of a 2V unknown scenario flown over the TACTS range. So 2 F-14s against an unknown number of adversaries. Who was the adversary? In this case, it was active duty U.S. Navy F-4 Phantoms. That's right, Phantoms. That's because, in general, the Phantom was a fair representation of the Flogger in terms of both aircraft performance and probably radar, although the Phantom's radar was probably a little bit better. The Phantom squadrons were told to provide between 2 and 6 aircraft, and they went out there and they operated full up, doing the best they could do. When I participated in Rising Fighter, I was flying with Jaws, and this was just a few months after we had gone through the Top Gun class together. So we worked very well together. We knew how each other operated in the cockpit, and I had total confidence in his flying abilities. For this flight, our wingman would be Cowboy and Ice, another crew from VF-24. We went into the briefing, And there were a few F-4 air crews there, but you couldn't tell how many we were going to be facing because they only sent a partial number to the brief. So they could just send one pilot, and then everybody else would be waiting back at the squadron. The event brief was given by a lieutenant assigned to the ComFit staff. He was a pilot who had flown at Miramar, probably fighters. I don't remember the guy's name. He was temporarily assigned to the staff. We had already been briefed on the whole overview of the project and the scenario, so the event brief was pretty short. He went in, he assigned range times, frequencies. He told the F-4s, go to the eastern station. He told the Tomcats, go to the western station, check in, and then the controller would call fights on. Now, at the end of that brief, he went over the ACM training rules, which at that time were called the rules of engagement. Most squadrons printed an abbreviated version of the training rules at the top of their kneeboard cards. Here's an example I have from VF2 in 1989. In VF24 back in 1982, it looked similar. And we called them rules of engagement at the time, but the term was later changed to training rules to avoid any confusion with the real-world rules of engagement about how you engage an enemy. So at the end of the event brief, this lieutenant pulled out his kneeboard card and said, okay, ROE, we need 5 miles visibility, 15,000 feet between layers. The deck is the deck. All aircraft need UHF, ICS, and monitor guard. Nordo aircraft, rock your wings, etc. Now, did you hear what I said for the second item? The deck is the deck. He didn't emphasize it. He didn't make a big deal out of it, but everybody in that briefing room heard him. Normally, the brief would have said 5,000 foot hard deck, 10,000 foot soft deck, but not on this day. We left the room. We went back to our squadrons, got dressed, manned up our jets, and flew over to Yuma. And this is where the fun began. Cowboy and Ice were on the left side. Jaws and I were on the right. We're flying over towards the tax range. We check our systems. Everything checks good. Check in with the range controller. Pods check good. Comms are good. Fighters call ready. The controller says, bogies are ready. Fight's on. He gives us a vector. It's probably a 32, 33 mile setup. We head onto the range, and pretty soon we start to see contacts on our radars. My system was working good. Pretty soon I'm seeing 6 targets, and I'm thinking, all right, this is going to be a good one. We are flying slick Tomcats, no Phoenix rails, no tanks, and our constructive loadout is 4 Sparrows and 4 Sidewinders. As the range starts to count down, Cowboy and Ice shoot a Sparrow, Jaws and I shoot a Sparrow. We also hear some missile launches from the Phantoms. After a few seconds, the controller comes up and says, 2, you're dead. That was Cowboy. He's our wingman. He does an aileron roll, peels off, and it leaves Jaws and I to fight the Phantoms on our own. The next thing the controller says is one of the Phantoms is dead. So now we're going 1v5 against F4 Phantoms. We hit the merge with a good amount of knots. Jaws formulates a game plan based on who we have in sight and immediately goes into a max performance turn. Max performance in the F-14A at that weight, at that time, 6.5 G nose low turn. We went nose low to keep our knots up to give us the ability to continue to pull Gs. So we get in, probably turn to the left. The wings come out pretty quickly, and we go into a steep nose low descending turn. Now, the intercept had been run at about 22,000 feet. Phantoms were up there with us. We go into this nose low turn, and pretty soon we're passing through 15,000, 10,000, 5,000, and soon we are fighting on the deck. When I say on the deck, I mean we're at 500 feet and below above the desert floor. Luckily, that part of the range is level, and so personally, I felt very comfortable down there. I'd never done ACM down there because it's prohibited. I talked to Jaws recently about this. He recalls the same situation, and he remembers thinking, we're part of this research project. I guess we've got special clearance to go down to low altitude. It's funny because this had never been discussed in detail in the brief. We didn't discuss it with anyone else in the flight, but we find ourselves down there on the deck with 5 Phantoms. So everybody had the same understanding. Jaws and I were very busy keeping track of all the keeping track of all the phantoms, and also shooting them. But just a few months before, we'd been in the Top Gun class. We had been challenged like this, and so we were up for it. A couple of things that I remember. One is that as we were flying low, this time we're in a right-hand turn, I remember looking out the rear cockpit, looking down the wing line, and seeing the maneuvering devices were out. The spoilers were coming up as Jaws was modifying our roll. There were vapes coming off the control surfaces. The wing was flexing up. I'm not going to bend this model or it'll break it, but the wing was flexing and shaking because we were in buffet. And right below the wing, just a few hundred feet, was the desert floor with all of the tumbleweeds. I mean, I can see that in my mind right now, and it's an image I hope I never forget. Did you take any pictures, Bio? No. Because of the nature of this flight, I didn't even take my camera in the cockpit with me, which was a policy that I had for myself back then. After a few moments, we've shot one or two of the Phantoms. It's hard for me to remember the engagement. I wish I remembered that much detail, but I just don't. But I do remember another part. Jaws was pursuing a Phantom. We were in a left-hand turn. Phantom was above our nose, and I'm watching the other guys, and I see a Phantom at right 4 o'clock coming down in a dive. My call on the ICS was right 4 o'clock approaching. That's all I said. I was confident Jaws knew what I meant. That meant approaching a threat. Something else that I had done for this flight, and it was one of my habits. The F-14A had the ALR 45 and 50 raw gear, radar homing and warning receiver, or RWR. The 45 and 50 were mechanized, so they normally would not display American radars as threats. Since we were fighting F-4 Phantoms, they would not display the Phantom as a threat unless you took the switches that were spring-loaded into the center position and put them in the bypass position. What did I do? I had a bunch of rubber bands and I ran them around the switches to hold them in the bypass position. So this Phantom is coming down, and in a few seconds, I get a warning strobe. He's got a radar lock. My response was to reach down and pump out some chaff. It immediately broke his radar lock. However, Jaws had to come hard right to neutralize that threat. The Phantom overshot, and then Jaws rolled back left, shot the guy that he had been pursuing. I wish I could tell you how many kills we got during the engagement, but I'm not sure. I asked Jaws. He doesn't remember either. We started with a 1v5. I'm sure we shot at least 3 of them, maybe 4. Anyway, after a couple of minutes, we both realized, we've done some pretty good work here. We're still alive. Let's bug out. Well, so right after we start to bug out, I look over Jaws' shoulder, and 1, I see mountains ahead of us, and 2, I can see him looking back to check 6. When I saw him looking back, I said, "Watch the mountains." Now, if you've watched the movie Top Gun, you may recognize that line, and that's because years later, when the Top Gun producers came onto Miramar and asked people if they had any things that they said in the cockpit, I told them this story, and that line made it into the movie. But in a more serious note, it was also a debrief point, because when we landed, Jaws said, "Why were you looking forward?" And I said, "Why were you looking back?" So we both agreed that when we flew together, we would stick to our primary areas of responsibility, and he could trust me to check 6, and I could trust him to look forward. So we knocked off that engagement, set up for a second one, and the second one was less remarkable. As I recall, on the second one, Jaws and I got kill removed on the intercept. Then we all flew back to Miramar. And we didn't really think anything of the engagement. We just knew we had done some great flying, and we anticipated a good debrief. We walked into the debrief room, and the same lieutenant from ComFit was very angry, and he opened with, "Don't ever fly that low again." And I'm sitting there, and my first thought was, you're the guy that said the words, "The deck is the deck." I don't recall any of us defending ourselves or making a big deal out of it. We just said, okay. And I also thought, hey, we already did this, and you can't take that away from us. Now, I wish I could recall the engagement in more detail, or I wish I had kept my kneeboard cards. Actually, what I would really like to see is the ACMI, the tax range tape from the engagement, but I don't think that's possible. All I can do is rely on the memories that I do have of the time that I fought an ACM engagement below the hard deck and got away with it. Check back because I've got more stories coming, and tell your friends about Tomcat memories. Cleared and switching.